In recent centuries, Australia has provided a home to our Jewish communities, and we therefore recognise our responsibilities and our obligations to Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples as Australia's first peoples, whose presence, culture, knowledge and diversity are vital to the nation we share. And we walk together with respect and care on this land that sustains us all. Beyond this, I'd like to let you know that I've dedicated my research to the survivors who have touched my life. And as you've heard from Lachlan, I work quite closely and extensively with Holocaust survivors, with their children, with their grandchildren, and now incredibly with their great-grandchildren. So to Eddie Jaku, who many of you would have heard about, he wrote The Happiest Man on Earth. I had the privilege to work with Eddie for many years. To Lottie Weiss, to Richard Haber, Celia Lederman, Maury Saperstein, Max Zilberman, Rita Ross, Yehudita Kleinman, and to all the survivors I haven't had the privilege to meet, to the 6 million Jews who were murdered in the Holocaust, I dedicate my project to you. I never claim to know or understand the trauma that you endured. I'm always humbled by your courage and your fortitude, and I apologize with the deepest humility for needing to quantify your trauma, to reduce it to numbers, for that is in effect what the Nazis did to you. But it is my hope that the results of this research will add greatly to our understanding of your journey, your trauma, your resilience, and the legacy of the long shadow of genocide and trauma. And so to dive in, the background leading up to the establishment of my research came from my clinical practice. As Lachlan said, I worked as a school psychologist in an independent Jewish day school in Sydney, and the school had many grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, some of whose grandparents and parents spoke about their experiences in the war, while others did not. The survivors are not a homogeneous group, in that some were interred at one or more concentration camps, some lived in ghettos, some were hidden by the righteous among the nations. And for those of you who don't know, the righteous among the nations are that group of people who are not Jewish, who risked their lives to protect and hide Jewish people. And they have been recognized by the Yad Vashem, which is the Israel Holocaust Memorial Museum, as with the highest possible honor that can be bestowed upon a civilian as the righteous among the nations. Some of the grandchildren grew up hearing their grandparents' stories, but others just unconsciously absorbed and interpreted the silence. Many, however, were the catalyst for the family deciding to record their family history, as 11, 12, and 13-year-old grandchildren engaged in projects like Project Heritage, which is a family heritage project. Having said this, this third generation consists of a wide range of people, an amorphous group that have become known as the third generation. But what's become really clear as this generation has emerged is that they undoubtedly exist with a distinct set of characteristics, as well as a unique and collective narrative. And a large portion of my clinical work was devoted to managing stress, anxiety, and depression. And to be perfectly honest with you, what appeared to be an apparent lack of resilience in this demographic of grandchildren of Holocaust survivors. So despite the fact that many of these children had not been directly exposed to trauma, they appeared to have an elevated stress response, increased levels of anxiety, and as I said, this ostensible lack of resilience. And because they hadn't been directly exposed to trauma, I began to think about what some of the possible explanations could be. And this kind of led me to my interest in epigenetics, which I will talk about a little bit later, as a possible explanation for these characteristics. But then, and for those of you who've ever done any research, you'll know, as you start to research, the more you research, the more questions you have. And so I began to delve deeper, not only at a research level, but at a clinical one too. And I realized that I was only looking at half the picture. So typical of most research is that we get answers to the questions we ask, but if we don't ask the questions, then we don't necessarily get the answers. And we typically make formulations through lenses that we're most comfortable with. So I decided to broaden my scope of questioning and my connections and networks to include survivors, children, and grandchildren that didn't only have narratives of trauma, but narratives of resilience, not only resilience, post-traumatic growth, and even beyond that, post-traumatic flourishing. And again, for those of you who knew Eddie Jaku, there is not a finer example of post-traumatic flourishing. For those of you who don't, Eddie was interred in 3 concentration camps. He survived a death march. He escaped Auschwitz, and he came to Australia as a refugee, where he was re-traumatized because he had a funny accent. I think a lot of the themes that a lot of you will recognize. His parents had funny accents. He didn't have grandparents. He was teased, and he basically decided to not hold on to the trauma, to not hold on to the hatred, and he decided that he would go on to make the world a better place. And at 101, he published his book, The Happiest Man on Earth. And I think it's now been published in 34 languages, and he is an international bestseller. Unfortunately, Eddie died a few months short of his 101st birthday, but it was an absolute privilege to be able to work with him. So that's how I landed here. And while the statistical results of my research are a way off, early data and anecdotal clinical information is exciting. So please come with me on this journey that led me here tonight. There is much contention in the literature about the transference of Holocaust trauma from the first generation offspring. Some, interestingly, contests that there are no statistically significant differences between Holocaust survivor children and the general population in regard to the development of anxiety and depression. Other researchers claim the exact opposite to be true. And with regard to the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors, the literature is much sparser. In one study, though, grandchildren of Holocaust survivors were overrepresented by as much as 300% in referrals to a child psychiatry clinic in Canada in comparison with their representation in the general population. Another study said that grandchildren of Holocaust survivors did not differ in their expression of aggression at all to the general population, and those results were seen as an interpretation, as an indication that transgenerational trauma had ceased in the third generation. I have to be honest, I firmly believe from my clinical practice and what's emerging in my research is that that is incorrect, that there is this intergenerational or transgenerational transmission of trauma. So if we dive in and we think about that 75 years after the Second World War, we are acutely aware of the unimaginably large number of stories that will forever remain untold, either because the survivors have passed away or because they chose while alive not to tell their stories. There are around 55,000 recorded testimonies across the various Holocaust repositories worldwide, which represents less than 1.8% of the total number of Jewish people who survived the Holocaust. But despite this, the remaining survivors provide us with incredibly rich testimony and lived experience, and that in turn gives us access to raw data. As I said, current research is robust, and there's definitely undeniable claims that indicate that trauma experienced by survivors is inherited by their children and grandchildren. There's not a lot of research that assesses intergenerational and transgenerational resilience, and even less that assesses both risk and resilience as a single construct. So just to clarify for you guys, because the terms are used interchangeably, intergenerational and transgenerational have very specific meanings in the field of epigenetics. So intergenerational refers specifically to any transmission that happens from the survivor to their direct offspring, in other words, Gen 1 to Gen 2. Transgenerational refers to the transmission that goes from the survivor to the third generation. So it skips a generation. And we know without a shadow of a doubt that that third generation hasn't been exposed in any way to the original trauma. So that in epigenetic terms is referred to as transgenerational trauma. What we know is that trauma caused by exposure to war and violence has major consequences, not only for the individuals, but for the societies and the communities that they affect. And we know that a parent's stressful experiences because of war and violence do influence an offspring's vulnerability to many pathological conditions, but more than that, to psychopathologies. And we are now seeing research coming out in the field of epigenetics that asserts that these effects may even endure for several generations. The key to understanding this transmission lies in our understanding of the mechanisms of transmission, and that's what my research is based on. I'm trying to look at as many different mechanisms of transmission in order to make sense of how the transmission occurs. There are many broad categories, and I'm going to, as I said, talk a little bit about epigenetics, but before I do that, closer to kind of the language that we all speak is psychological pathways of trauma transmission. And they can be sort of divided quite broadly into 4 categories. So the first is the vicarious identification of children with their parents suffering at a similar stage of chronological development. And so what we see clinically in the children of Holocaust survivors is that they will often develop a struggle with mental health at a time when they turn a similar age to what their parents were during the war. The other thing that we've noticed is that many of the second gen will only come to therapy once their parents have passed away, because simply talking about the impact that their parents' trauma may have had on them is too much of a burden to place on their parents. And so we often see that they are recalling the onset of any sort of mental health issues that they've struggled with at a time where their parents were in the war, whether that was as a child or as a teenager. Most survivors who I talk to, their main goal in life is to make sure that the trauma stops with them. And sadly, as we know, but we never say it to them, and especially now that we understand epigenetics, that this is not true, that genocide has a very long shadow, and that the trauma doesn't actually stop with them. But the second gen are very mindful of the space that takes up for their parents. And so they don't necessarily talk to their parents about it or talk about it while their parents are alive. The second broad category of transmission is this intuitive responsibility that's assumed by the children to compensate in various ways for their parents' suffering. In Holocaust literature, there are terms that we call memorial children or candle children. So often the children that were born post-war, so the late 40s and the early 50s, were named after somebody who had been murdered in the Holocaust. And they landed up bearing the burden of grief that their parents were experiencing, sometimes spoken, sometimes unspoken, as they became the memorial child. They became the beacon of everything that was lost, which you can imagine has a huge responsibility, huge impact on a developing child. And something that emerged is a phrase that we coin the double wall of silence. And so what happened is the survivors chose not to talk about their experiences because they didn't want to burden their children. But the children in the same way became perfect children because they didn't want in any way to burden their parents with any other hardship other than what they had already experienced. And so this double wall of silence emerged. And when we talk to second gen, we see it played out most clearly in, interestingly, their career choices. So many second generation offspring did not do what they didn't follow their dreams. They did what their parents wanted them to do. And it's a little bit of a sort of a stereotype that Jewish children need to study law or medicine. And there's actually quite a sad reality as to why that was, because the parents were saying to them, the Nazis could take away everything from you except what was in your mind. So if you become a doctor, if you have to pack up and run away, they can't take away the knowledge that's in your mind. And so many young Jewish people who wanted to maybe be filmmakers or musicians had this burden of responsibility that they would please their parents. They became these perfect children. The third mechanism of transmission demonstrated by survivors towards their offspring was particular patterns of parenting. And we are so much more aware now through the work of people like Ainsworth about attachment ruptures and attunement and misattunement. One of the survivors who I work so closely with, often she was a 13, 14-year-old child when her whole family were murdered. And she basically talks about the fact that she had no role models. She said, how was I to be a parent when I had never watched anyone parenting me? And then not only that, she's living with the trauma of having lost her entire extended family, 70 people. And so most prominent in her mind is this trauma. And so when her children are growing up, there is so much misattunement that it leads to attachment ruptures. I recently did some professional development with Bessel van der Kolk, and he basically asserts that chronic childhood misattunement has more of an impact on the developing brain than a single trauma. So we start to get a sense of what it was like for the second generation to grow up in these homes where their parents really could not tune in to their needs. And if they did, it was often dismissive, like, oh, what have you got to worry about? You don't know what hardship is. So often their feelings were minimized or diminished. And then the last thing is styles of communication between parents and their children concerning traumatic experiences. So I've spoken about Eddie before, and he had a very, very public persona. He was an absolute showman. He was charismatic and he was charming. But we know from his children that he had a very different persona in the home. And often the children the style of communication was a very mixed message. So on the one hand, how their parents were communicating was that you've got to go out there and live for everyone who died and make the world a better place and make a difference. But on the other hand, the world is fundamentally a very, very scary place. So be very, very careful. And so the second gen had this real mixed message of you go out there and be brave, but also be terrified. We know that intergenerational transmission is unintentional, and it often happens without the awareness of the contribution of the original traumatic event. But we know from people like Ainsworth that it often causes attachment disruptions and results in difficulty with coping adaptations later on in life, so that the mental health of the parent is directly affects the child in their care. We do know, and this research is in its infancy, but it's so exciting, that there are protective factors. And we know that high levels of family cohesion act as a protective factor, as do religious and spiritual practices, more proactive parenting styles, and most importantly, and we see this in the Jewish community, is community bonds and memorialization. So, as I said, recently intergenerational resilience has come into the spotlight, and there's certainly some evidence that demonstrates that in the face of adversity and loss, war-affected families do not only run away from war, but are also able to repair and grow and even pass down their adaptive capacities from the recovery repertoire to the next generation. What appears to be missing in the current discourse is the idea that the survivors, the offspring and the grandchildren can struggle with both the contradictory forces of vulnerability and resilience as a single construct. So we know that the first and second generation were affected, but the third generation are emerging with a really different presentation. And I hope you can see that I'm sort of passionate about working with them because I'm inspired by them as much as I am by their grandparents. Our understanding of trauma is evolving and changing. And now more than ever, I think we need to factor in that trauma has this component of resilience in it. In the PD with Bessel van der Kolk, he basically said that we are, in terms of our understanding of trauma and its impact on the human brain, a little bit like Galileo looking down his telescope for the first time. Like we've got a long way to go before we truly understand. I'm just aware of the time, but I do think it's interesting to look at where we've come from in terms of trauma so that we know where we're going. And I'll just go through this really, really quickly. So the relationship between trauma and mental illness was first investigated by Charcot in the late 19th century. He studied hysteria. interestingly, a disorder commonly diagnosed in women. Even the ancient Egyptians and Greeks apparently believed that wombs were capable of affecting the rest of the body's health. And in ancient Greece specifically, it was believed that the uterus could migrate around the female body and place pressure on different organs, causing any number of ill effects. And in fact, this roaming uteri theory was supported by amazing philosophers like Plato and the physician Ateus, and he called it hysterical suffocation. The philosopher and physician Galen disagreed with the roving uterus theory in believing instead that it was the retention of female seed within the womb that was to blame for anxiety, insomnia, depression, irritability, fainting, and other symptoms experienced by women. Now, I'm making light of this, but if you think about those words, anxiety, insomnia, depression, irritability, and you think about that from ancient Greek times, those are words we use in our current diagnosis criteria for PTSD. So in 1880, when Charcot was taking a more sort of scientific look at this, one of the students in his class was Freud, and Freud went on to be the founder of psychoanalysis, and he basically believed that hysteria was a result not of a physical injury to the body, but of a psychological scar produced through trauma. Specifically, the psychological damage was as a result of removing male sexuality from females, an idea that stems from his famous Oedipal moment of recognition, in which a young female realizes she no longer has a penis. So fortunately, we've moved on from that definition. We get to World War I, where psychiatrists start to observe that soldiers returning from battle with a cluster of symptoms, which they call shell shock syndrome. And it's the first time we start to think about psychological first aid. It was only in 1981, and this is significant because it's about the time that the DSM came out, which was 1980. So we're 3.5 decades after the Second World War, where a Dutch psychiatrist by the name of Nederland coined the term survivor syndrome. He had worked with over 2,000 Holocaust survivors, and he used the term survivor syndrome or concentration camp syndrome to acknowledge that this was a type of massive traumatization of such magnitude and severity that it caused a recognizable clinical entity. He went on to say that this syndrome developed irrespective of age, sex, individual, or sociocultural background, and he felt that it was chronic and severe and presented with unique difficulties to the patient. So as I said, 1980, the APS introduces the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, and for the first time we get a definition of post-traumatic stress disorder, and this was actually associated with the return of the veterans from Vietnam. In the 5th edition, we have an increasingly more complex picture of PTSD, where the definition says there's exposure to actual or threatened death, serious injury, sexual violence, including war, physical assault, threatened or actual sexual violence, terrorism, natural or human-made disasters, and severe accidents. So we start to see how it's becoming more and more complex and how it's taking into account more and more things. We know from the transactional model of stress that this idea of the developing post-traumatic stress syndrome is a mixture of an individual sort of personality trait and an external environment. And the individual exposed to the traumatic event will process this event uniquely, and their capacity to do so will be dictated by their own pre-existing vulnerabilities or coping resources. I'm going to talk a little bit now, because of this interaction between gene and environment, about epigenetics. It does provide us with a possible molecular framework to account for this interaction of gene and environment, and the way that it shapes risk for psychiatric disorders. So we know that epigenetics has been shown to play a decisive role in neuronal adaptations. And it's kind of exciting, because we used to think that human babies were born with almost like a tabula rasa, a clean slate in terms of their DNA. We now are only starting to understand that certain epigenetic modifications are being transmitted in utero and are being presented in the child that's born. And if I can put this into lay terms, and trust me, it's taken me a long time because I'm not a biologist or a molecular scientist to try and make sense of epigenetics in lay terms. I'll try and explain it to you in the way that I understand it, but please stop me and ask questions if you want to. So epigenetic modifications are essentially where a chemical tag attaches to a certain place on the human genome where it has the effect of either silencing or switching on a gene. And what happens, and certainly in the research that's coming up from people like Rachel Yehuda, they are looking at candidate genes, so very specific genes that are implicated in the stress response. The one that Rachel Yehuda's investigating is called the FKBP5 gene, and it is specifically it codes for the production of what we call glucocorticoid receptor sites. It's a big word, it doesn't matter. Basically what it is, it's the receptor site at which cortisol, which is a neurotransmitter, passes through our central nervous system. What she found is that in the Holocaust survivors, that gene was hypermethylated. In other words, it was switched on and there was much, much more production of these receptor sites. Now, if you think about it, it makes sense, because if you are in a constant state of fight, flight, or freeze, and not being in that state could potentially mean death, then having more of these glucocorticoid receptor sites makes a lot of sense. You need cortisol to be coursing through your body so that you are hyper alert, so that you are hyper vigilant, and you need that state in order to stay alive. What she found in the children of Holocaust survivors is that gene was hypomethylated. In other words, the exact opposite. There wasn't a lot of that gene coding for the glucocorticoid receptor site. And so if we think about that, if there are not a lot of those receptor sites, what happens to the cortisol in our body? It just circulates. And by implication, and this is very simplistic, does that mean that we have heightened levels of anxiety and depression because we've got the circulating cortisol that never gets absorbed or properly processed, so that our central nervous system, our HPA axis, can downregulate? Certainly in animal studies, this has been widely researched, and the most famous one is the cherry blossom study, where generation 1 of the mice were given an electric shock at the same time that they were exposed to the scent of a cherry blossom. 4 generations later, the mice pups were exposed to a cherry blossom scent, and they demonstrated a stress response even though they had not been exposed to the electric shock. There are a lot of human studies coming out now, stuff coming out of the Rwandan genocide, stuff coming out of the Feyli Kurdish genocide. And so we are only really at our infancy in terms of understanding epigenetic transmission. We know that it's happening, but we're not really sure why and how, and we're certainly not sure what it means from a clinical perspective. But the psychologist Peter Levine, who has worked with several second-generation Holocaust survivors, noticed that during their sessions, they were often startled by a nauseating smell of burning flesh. And this occurred along with an intense visceral reaction, nausea, fear, and palpable dread that something horrible would happen. Although he's reluctant to consider this as proof of generational trauma, he does suggest that the smell transmission is worth examining alongside the cherry blossom experiment with the mice. And he notes further that children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors frequently describe specific and horrific images, sensations, and emotions and events that seem quite real but could not possibly have happened to them. So we know that epigenetics does offer us new insights, but as I say, we really are in our infancy in terms of our understanding. I'm going to sort of come to an end now, but I don't feel like I can before sort of addressing this idea that collective trauma experienced by communities is carried on as part of the group's collective memory and shared sense of identity. And certainly since the early documentation of the effects of systemic trauma on Holocausts and future generations, there is now a compelling body of research emerging from other communities and groups who've experienced systemic trauma. For example, our own First Nations people in Australia and New Zealand, and there's a lot of incredible work coming out of the First Nations people in Canada. According to Goldsmith, and I think this is so important, this perspective of intergenerational and transgenerational trauma must extend beyond war. And we have to take into consideration the influence and the impact of environments such as the schools, the universities, the churches, the religious institutions, the military, the workplace, the hospitals, the jails, and the prisons, the agencies and the systems such as police, foster care, immigration, federal assistance, and media, and the impact that all of those institutions had on our communities, and as well as the dynamics of racism, sexism, discrimination, bullying, and homophobia. She goes on to state that although it may be challenging to expand our psychological and psychiatric paradigms of trauma, this systemic trauma perspective is necessary not only on scientific grounds, but on ethical grounds as well. And I couldn't agree more. The hard thing is that certainly working in the space of Holocaust literature and research, it is the most widely investigated period in human history. But what it doesn't do, because the trauma is 75 years past, is take into account that many of the communities that we're dealing with who are currently facing oppression and social and economic disadvantage. And so when we talk about recovery, we talk about there's an implication that you are recovering from something that's happened in the past, but recovery might feel impossible because the trauma is ongoing and it's present. And so we need to be so mindful of this, that we don't just apply the learnings that we have from the Holocaust to all communities, but that we come to it with a cultural and a community sensitivity. But what I do know for sure is that there is evidence of a groundswell of pride and reclamation and resilience in these communities, despite the fact that the trauma is still present. So in terms of intergenerational resilience, and I'm aware of the time, there's a similar mechanism going on, and it's this interaction of environment and personal and individual capabilities that we see interacting that leads to intergenerational resilience. And some of the early work, which I have to be honest, I don't necessarily agree with, speaks about the fact that those survivors who were able to be or to demonstrate resilience employed a coping strategy of intellectualization or cognitive restructuring. They were able to distance themselves from their parental trauma. I'm not so sure how I feel about that, because I don't know that that's healthy. I'm not sure that that's not some sort of dissociation. More recent research, I think, is much more promising, and certainly with coming out of Rwanda, which is the healing and reconciliation that is happening through spiritual disciplines and through practices that are both individual and collective, and that these are leading to significant traumatic recovery. I just want to kind of make one last point about the research that specifically looks at adverse childhood experiences, or the ACEs study. It typically overlooks the narratives of resilience, resulting in a lopsided and predominantly negative perspective of functioning following childhood adversity. And certainly with the grandchildren of Holocaust survivors that I'm working with, I'm seeing, as I said, this almost combined construct of resilience and vulnerability in a single individual, and the resilience becomes a call to action. So I work with a group of Holocaust survivor grandchildren who've started an organization called Youth Here. And basically the HERE stands for Holocaust Education and Outreach. And their mandate is to mitigate hate in society. They want to reach out to other communities. They genuinely want to make the world a better place. And they have internalized the story of their grandparents. And so the narrative has changed from one of shame into one of survivor, and one of pride, and one of resilience. And they are genuinely trying to make the world a better place. So what's emerging from my research as I expand the questions I'm asking, not only about trauma, but also about resilience and about the two incorporated into a single construct, is that this third generation is now marking its own relational awareness. It's devising its own nomenclature. They're abbreviating things in a new way, like second gen, gen to gen, 3G. They have a Facebook page and a Twitter handle. It's at 3G worldwide, like their already obsolete generational designation of their smartphones. I've learned that more than a few of these grandchildren of survivors are being tattooed with the numbers of their aging, dying grandparents. A brief numerical sequence, identically blue, wavering in shape, imperfectly raw and upside down, to remember what the permanent yet faded number looked like from their point of view of on their grandparents' forearms, to remember, to bear witness on their own skin until the next generation has to choose what to inscribe, what to claim. I meet all these 3G who see it as a responsibility and not a burden, and as a badge of honor, because they say we are obligated to remember imperfectly and uncomfortably. This duty is incumbent on each of us because it's the truth of being human. We own everything that happened to us and everything that happened to others before us. And that includes holding the guns, holding the babies, watching the ones with the guns shooting the babies, and then the mothers, and the mothers holding the babies, watching, and the babies yet to be born, watching. There are photos, there are videos, there are films and books and voices recorded to last for as long as we have ears to listen. But can we promise to listen? Can we promise that the listening will last? Is it enough simply to listen? What will happen when we can no longer see the minute impressions of grief and loss inscribed on someone's skin? Not just the tattooed number, not just the relentless hunger, not the absence behind the eyes, nor the tears, nor the silence. There is something so literal and tangible that we will lose when we cannot sit across the table from the person who was the 6-year-old girl, making herself quieter than a mouse behind a secret door, the person who pretended to be dead among the mounds of dead. As Nobel Peace Laureate Elie Wiesel said, when you listen to a witness, you become a witness. Thank you.